going to school in the 1940s, well, it was quite unusual, not only unusual, unheard of, for any of my schoolmates to even think of going on to university. As to finish second level education would be quite an achievement. We didn't think third level education was for the likes of us at all. That's how things were at the time. And I was not different from the rest of my schoolmates.
Nice, decent, honest man, good company, cultivated, dedicated to the people. Never looked for any great rewards for himself.
The comparison with Swift, which some people have made, I think is certainly valid in terms of his deep concern and anger at the treatment of the less fortunate.
He loved radio, documentaries and everything, and while he'd be reading, he liked his own company a lot. He never changed that way, and he would be listening to the radio or his music while he would be reading.
But he'd always give me something that would be more into my line of thinking, Seamus Heaney, book on Seamus Heaney, the poet. Kenneth Branagh, the actor, Victor Golans, the publisher, who was a great man and helped an awful lot of people to write, and Jim would like him because he was helping people. Jack Doyle, the boxer, who came up from nothing down in the coal quays in Cork and bowled the world over and then wound up a drunk in London. And Jim would have great sympathy with him. He made it and lost it again. One book he gave me which intrigued me, but it's called Thomas Sheridan of Smock Alley. And Smock Alley is a place in Dublin just behind Guinness's brewery, and there was a theatre there. And Thomas Sheridan was the father of Richard Brinsley Sheridan, who wrote The Rifles and all these things, and actually latterly became a member of the English Parliament, I think. Now, who else would have that book except Jim?
Jim Kemmy spent his life encouraging people. If there is one common thread running throughout his pursuits, it seems to be this. Whether as Dáil deputy or mayor, or historian or anthologist, he did it all to give individuals a hand up. He helped people materially. Few more generous men have walked the streets of Limerick, and he gave them hope. By overcoming the difficulties of his early life to become a national figure, he showed others that they could follow. More than a working-class hero, he was a man for all seasons, whose humility, honesty, and concern to put people first prevent us pigeonholing him in narrow class stereotypes. In his unique way, he showed that the mould could and sometimes should be broken. There may have been apparent contradictions in his character, but thankfully he had the courage to live them out to the full. This tribute attempts to serve as a useful, if limited, introduction to Jim Kemmy and to the circumstances in which his life was played out. In a revealing interview reproduced in the Irish Times, Jim explained that he had to unscramble the personality which was made for him. The way he chose to do this was through political engagement, and for Jim Kemmy, the personal became political and politics personal, as his colleague and friend Jan O'Sullivan explains.
Well, I suppose the thing about Jim was that I think his politics were very much formed out of his life experience, and the fact that he had to emigrate in the 50s at a young age, having left school at 15, and the fact that he went abroad to England and very much kind of learnt, in a way, got his education over there in terms of introducing himself to books and introducing himself to the fact that there was a different life outside of Ireland. I think that actually formed his experience of life in many ways, because He lived at a time when Ireland was very narrow. It was very enclosed, and there were things that you could think and things that you couldn't think, and things that you could say and things that you couldn't say. It was very much controlled by the Catholic Church at the time. And I think when Jim went away, he found a totally different world, particularly through books. And when he came back, I think he was determined that he was going to be instrumental in opening up Irish society and in giving people space to think for themselves, and giving people maybe who had different points of view and different approaches to life the opportunity and the space to be themselves, as opposed to that very narrow sort of one-dimensional society that he had grown up in the 50s.
Dedicating his life to changing that society, he found in recent history hope for a better future. In an interview recorded in 1990, he recounts a moment from his city's and family's past that might have inspired him.
6 Limerick pork butchers and 6 Limerick bricklayers went to Russia to carry out the building of furnaces and chimneys, and also to show the Russians how to cure bacon, how to kill pigs and so on. Because Limerick at that time, 100 years ago, was famous throughout Europe as a centre of bacon curing. The curing of the bacon in Limerick had a special flavour and a special skill in doing so. And O'Mara's were one of the premier bacon companies at that time. There were 2 other firms here, Matheson's and Shaw's. But O'Mara's were very adventurous in securing contacts throughout Europe, as I mentioned, and one of them was in Russia 100 years ago in 1891. Indeed, one of the people who travelled on that trip was my grandfather. He was a bricklayer and went to Russia. So it's very unique to think of that less than 100 years ago, that Limerick was exporting technology to Russia. And now today Russia is a major world power, has sent spaceships and people into space and so on, is a leader in that respect and has come on by leaps and bounds. But the economy and the technology was so backward in 1891 that Limerick tradesmen had to go there to teach the Russians the skills of bacon curing.
If he drew positively from aspects of the past, there were also darker and more complex issues he had to work through and learn from, such as the city's treatment of the Jewish community, as Dick Walsh, political editor of the Irish Times, suggests.
I think that there's great relevance here in Jim's attitude to the events that were called the Jewish pogrom in the first decade of the century. He would point out that the priest who was held responsible for provoking a lot of the trouble at that time, a Father Gray, a Redemptorist, that he was also interested in helping the poor of Limerick, who, in his view, were plagued by moneylenders. And I think that it's important to distinguish, and Jim did distinguish, between Father Gray's sympathy for poor people and moving from there to a racist opposition to the Jews.
While the particular events of the so-called pogrom were short-lived, they indicated a longer-lasting attitude in which the Limerick Arch-Confraternity was implicated.
I'm not saying that, say, the Arch-Confraternity was a bad thing, because obviously for the people who went in for that kind of stuff, it was comforting and stimulating and so on. But it gave rise to a terrible amount of collective bigotry, and it was bigotry.
As against this tide of chauvinism, there was also, in Kemmy's native city, a more broad-minded and internationalist current, evident in an event described by Jim.
In 1918, May Day, or Labour Day, was held in Limerick for the first time, and between 10 and 15,000 Limerick workers marched to the Macclesfield to the sound of a trumpet. Speeches were given from 3 platforms, and one of the first items on the agenda that day was a motion congratulating the Russian workers on having secured their freedom. This was now the year after the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union, which took place in 1917. A year after, 1918, in Limerick, Limerick workers expressed solidarity with the Russian comrades and expressed their full support for the revolution there.
These two events, the eviction of the Jews and the May Day March occurred respectively in the first and second decades of the 1900s. They epitomised some of the contradictory political forces at work in Limerick City throughout the ensuing century. The year following the march in Market's Field, the government of the city took a radical turn during the brief Limerick Soviet of 1919.
Jim looked back to that time, saw that the people in Limerick were capable of working for themselves and organising themselves. They ran the city. They ran almost the whole city, including the port, of course, which was very important, and some of the bigger industries in the city of Limerick. They looked after things like allowing people in from the Clare side of the river and letting people in to the city on other routes. They were beginning to, I think, handle the documentation of the city and the administration of the city. They were doing this in a most democratic fashion. They were doing it in a way that may very well have upset some of the nationalists as well as some of the more conservative elements in the place.
Subsequently, there came a pronounced political reversal in the city and throughout the country.
The revolutionary spirit of the period from 18 to 22-23, which featured in Limerick the creation of the Limerick Soviet, was subsumed into the new conservative nationalism of the new state, and that was very inward-looking. It was afraid of thought and questioning, and it looked towards a very formal, orthodox form of Catholicism and a very limited kind of politics. It looked to these for protection against the outside world and protection really from its own vulnerability and its own fears.
By mid-century, any alternative form of political organisation was regarded as a threat.
I remember that when I was still at school, I became a member of an organisation called Christian Republic, Poblacht Christul, which was set up by, among others, two Scottish teachers who were teaching in the College of Art in Limerick, Pat McAvoy and Matt Mannery. And they based their political philosophy on a reading of the papal encyclicals, Quadragesima Anno and Rerum Novarum. But when they said their piece publicly, when we had meetings or made any approaches to newspapers, they were treated as if they were communists or some kind of very unorthodox people. The idea that you would expect even papal encyclicals, I'm not talking here about the Communist Manifesto or the works of Marx and Engels, the idea that you could translate that into political life and the ordinary life of a city or whatever else, that seemed to be outrageous to people.
More than the other Irish cities, Limerick was associated with this oppressive social atmosphere. But even there, and during those decades, the political left survived, as Joe Kemmy, Jim's brother, explains.
After the last World War, there was a kind of a swing to the right, a swing to the left in Europe, and a swing to the right in places like Ireland. And I suppose when Churchill was turfed out and the Labour government put in. But the 50s with high unemployment and so on, and the role of the church, which was very, very powerful in Ireland, you know, the Cold War and so on, it was very, very difficult for the development of any type of left-wing politics in the country. And Limerick, I'd say, was no more different than any other city in the country. What made it seem to be very conservative was the high profile of the Arts Confraternity. But it frequently threw up a Labour TD of one sort or another, back from the days of Michael Keyes. And I never, having grown up in Limerick in the 50s, I never looked at it as a totally conservative city, but that's often the image that the public faces of the church may have portrayed.
Arguably, it wasn't the social climate in the Limerick of Jim Kemmy's youth that played the decisive role in shaping the man he was to become. Though he grew up in a working-class area of the city, neither of his parents was politically active. His father, Michael Kemmy, was of a family of stonemasons, whose home was at 3 Garryowen, Limerick. His mother, Elizabeth Pilkington, was from a family involved in agriculture in Kilmihill, County Clare. She had come to Limerick to find work, and while employed by the Goodwins who ran the Corrigower Bar on Clancy's Strand, she met her future husband. For a brief period following their marriage, they lived in rented accommodation at 18 O'Curry Street, before moving into the family home at Garryowen. It was while living in O'Curry Street that, on the 14th of September 1936, Jim, eldest in a family of 5, was born. Jim's character was formed in the home. From his parents he would have inherited an inquiring mind and an appreciation of the written word. Michael and Elizabeth Kemmy were members of the public library. There they borrowed books and journals to supplement their reading of the old volumes that had remained in the Kemmy household for generations. Michael also sculpted and painted in his spare time, using what materials he had to hand, though he hadn't received any formal art education. But despite his gentleness and creativity, Michael, like Elizabeth, was a strong and independently minded person. Each of these traits was inherited by Jim. In his early years, given his parents' interest in reading, it's not surprising to find that Jim did well at school.
I was in 8th class in primary school in 6th Street CBS. I spent 1 year in the secondary school, and then I went on to I was waiting to start work as an apprentice mason. I spent 1 year in the Technical Institute in O'Connell Avenue in Limerick, and I liked my schooling. I was good at English especially, and history, and geography, good at those subjects. And indeed I recall winning a scholarship during my 1 year in the technical school. I won a scholarship for Irish speaking, Irish language. Spent a month in a class to Oni Curry, Eugene O'Curry College, Carrigo Hall, County Clare. And one of my teachers in the technical school was Mr. McMahon, the father of Ciarán McMahon, the well-known RT broadcaster. And one day in my English class, he was impressed with an essay I wrote. He read my essay to the class, and he told the class that it was very good, and he predicted one day I would write a book. So that's a little proud moment to have as well. I won a medal, I think, in the PLMD also for history. But just a little checkered life that I had, and no different from the generality of boys and girls, I suppose, who grew up in the 40s.
In contrast with the encouraging progress Jim was making in his studies, the circumstances in the Kemmy household during those years grew increasingly difficult. Having contracted the then prevalent disease of tuberculosis, his father's health went into decline. Joan Hartnett, one of Jim's 2 sisters, recalls.
My earliest recollection would be of him talking about places, Bar, Clough Jordan. All these places were known to me as a very small child because he would have been there, and coming home he'd been mentioning places around the country that I just knew the names of. That's where he'd been working, and he would get back. And I remember tales of damp boarding houses, the rain coming in the window, and umbrellas open over beds and all this kind of thing. Conditions were very rough that time.
Michael Kemmy's absence from work due to illness resulted in a loss of income for the Kemmy family. Even so, Elizabeth, an industrious and practical woman, found ways of making ends meet.
She was a fantastic, very hard-working woman. And when my father got ill, she grew our own vegetables. We were fortunate enough to have a large back garden, and she kept hens, and we were never hungry. We were always very well fed, and she used to say that was why none of us got TB, because we were very well nourished, which we were.
Reared in the vicinity of Garryowen and adjacent the grounds of Pike Rovers Football Club, novelist and broadcaster David Hanley recalls something of the hardship of those years for Jim Kemmy.
My earliest and most vivid memory of Jim Kemmy was of a morning, a winter's morning, a Sunday morning in Clahorn, which was behind our house in Limerick, where there was a football pitch. It's covered over in houses now, of course. And it was a really filthy Sunday morning. Pike Rovers were playing somebody else, and my father was treasurer of Pike Rovers, so I was perforce a supporter and on the sideline, and all dressed up against the sleet and rain that was coming down, and freezing cold. And I was in class with Joe Kemmy, and I knew that he had a brother. And my memory is of seeing this tall, ungainly, if not downright clumsy person, unprepossessing, standing there on the sideline also, watching the game, but he had no coat on. Now, I seem to remember being impressed by this hardiness as I perceived it. Now, maybe that's a false memory or a retrospective one. But it was years, many years, before I realized why he didn't have a coat that Sunday morning. And it's my own belief that that experience, not that specific experience on the football pitch, but the kind of life that that particular experience represented, marked him all of his life.
Having completed his primary certificate at the Christian Brothers, Jim nevertheless did not leave school to find a job. His love of learning prevailed, and so he continued his studies, spending a year at the secondary school in Sexton Street, and then a further year at the Municipal Technical Institute. It was only in 1952, having turned 16, the legal age for entering a trade, that Jim left school to earn a living. As a member of a family of stonemasons, it went without saying that Jim would follow his father into what was then the AG&I Brick and Stone Layers Trade Union, in which he served his apprenticeship during the following 5 years. The next year, 1953, Michael Kemmy was too ill to work and was soon confined to the sanatorium. Jim was the one family member old enough to visit his father. What he witnessed there deeply affected him. In 1955, Michael Kemmy died. Jim, who was still in his teens, suddenly had much to cope with, including the responsibility of providing for his family. If he didn't show much emotion outwardly, the impact would have been profound, as his sister Maureen McAteer explains.
How can one watch a beautiful, sensitive man become ill and fade away in such a painful manner? How can you bear witness to that without it affecting you in such a deep, profound way?
An extract from Mrs. McAteer's poem, Tell Me About Your Father, written about Michael Kemmy, captures much of the family's early life up to that point.
Tell me about your father. It's for a school project, Mammy. Tell me about your father. A gentleman who loved poetry and philosophy. A mason like his father, his skill coaxed fluid movement from cold, stubborn stone. Too poor to purchase proper artist materials, he scavenged bits and scraps to sculpt, sketch and paint, delicate watercolours and bold oils, all with eclectic ease. But in the 50s, tuberculosis unfurled its fiendish tentacles, ensnaring strapping men and fine women. It caught him in its voracious grasp. In the still air of peaceful Pau, the wealthy wistfully whiled away their final days in pursuit of phantom cures, while the poor sojourned in the sanatorium, waving poignantly at indicated specks on the horizon, flesh of their flesh, distanced for fear of contamination. There he and they coughed their last in sad solidarity, as one by one they went down like ducks in a shooting gallery. Your grandmother often said, "You are just like your father, you'll never be able for this world." But I think a pinch of pragmatism leached from maternal genes marbled that precious paternal inheritance of a dreamer's heart.
The situation at work didn't make life any easier for Jim. Being an apprentice stonemason in the 50s often meant low wages and being unemployed for months at a time. Jean Kerrigan, writing about Jim Kemmy for the Sunday Tribune in 1991, noted that as an apprentice stonemason, Kemmy was getting 8 old pence an hour and was learning how the world works. He sought an increase to second-year rates, 1 shilling and a penny, and a week later was sacked. In 1957, having been out of work for 6 months, Jim qualified as a stonemason. He left home for England in search of a stable income for the family. Jim recorded some of his feelings from the time in his poem Exiled Memory 57.
Lifeline dwindling to that lone option, the inescapable move for survival and self-respect, forced out to a pagan world by hopeless unemployment. Numbed, confused family parting, unreal train journey to Dublin, uninvited visit from young Legion of Mary girl asking well-rehearsed questions. Last bitter look from Dunleary. Sickening loneliness and disillusionment of the boat crossing. Long, restless haul from Holyhead. Bleak 6:45 a.m. arrival at Euston. Tired, dirty, nervous. First startling sight of black workers. Awkwardness on underground escalator. Smells and noises of station. Emotional shock at sexy posters. Blurred, strange names flashing past. Fogged windows of subway train. Fighting down a galloping panic and a desire to catch the next train home. Solitary search for a room and job, in bewildering places among self-absorbed people. Relentless feelings of inadequacy, crowding and clouding the mind, yearning for the stability of the familiar, cornered by fear of the unknown, straining for a homely voice or a helping hand, choked with homesickness, hoping for the best, fearing the worst, holding on.
The confused emotions which Jim Kemmy experienced on leaving Ireland were all the more oppressive in that he knew no way to express them. In the 1993 Irish Times interview, he put the problem in these terms.
Whether we can express ourselves or not doesn't mean we're insensitive, he says. It caused people like me much anguish and mental suffering that we couldn't express ourselves properly. I had later to unscramble the personality which was made for me, and that's very hard to do as an adult.
The Ireland he left behind, inward-looking and paternalistic, effectively prevented its population from realising that life didn't have to be as it then was. The Catholic Church, one of the most influential forces supporting censorship in Ireland, continued to dominate Jim's outlook for some time while in England. Patsy Harold, Jim's long-term friend and companion, tells an anecdote illustrating Jim's attitude when he arrived in London.
He was paid one Friday and he was rushing. He was very hungry, it was a lunch hour, but he wanted to send the money home to his mother, you see. And he bought a sandwich. He didn't know what kind of sandwich he bought. A sandwich. He was very hungry, just eating the way up to the post office. And there was ham in it. And he spat it out because he knew he shouldn't eat meat on a Friday.
However, while in London, where he worked for the best part of 3 years, he discovered how he could make sense of his emotions and personal experience and unscramble the hurt and anger of his earlier life in Limerick. The very different social conditions, the freedom of thought and expression he encountered there, challenged and changed his beliefs. John Flynn, a stonemason from Limerick, who met him in England, witnessed the confrontation of values experienced by Jim.
I went to England in 55, 56, and I met Jim in London. And Jim had come over then. I'd have been gone before Jim. I would have been gone to England before Jim. And his big thing of London was going up to High Park Corner every Sunday morning. I used to be amazed at myself watching all these Franciscans and the different religions. We said like the Redemptorists and all these people roaring and shouting their heads off, and you'd hear all the people roaring back. It used to be very embarrassing seeing that we were coming from Limerick of myself, and we couldn't understand anybody shouting or roaring at the priests, you know. We couldn't. It was shocking. We couldn't believe that people would be roaring and shouting at the priest. But Jim used to enjoy all that.
Jim's traditional Catholic values were further undermined as he had the opportunity at his lodgings to read books that had been banned in Ireland. In an autobiographical article written for the Democratic Socialist magazine entitled Some Influential Books, he wrote, "One evening a copy of John Steinbeck's novel In Dubious Battle fell into my hands. The book was a revelation. It was the first time I had ever read a socialist work of any kind. I found that Steinbeck was a different type of writer from the kind I had previously read. He clearly had great working-class sympathies and wrote with realism about the exploited laborers in America, especially the itinerant farm workers of California. His introduction to socialist novels was only part of the political education he received while in London."
The left in Ireland has always lacked some of the background that existed in England. Obviously, there were historical reasons for that, and there were cultural reasons for it. And one of the things that happened in Jim's political education and cultural education, I think, was when he went to England and found his way into that side of the left in England, where the local Carnegie Library and the lending libraries and libraries paid for out of public funds and by trade unions in some cases were important, where they provided people with literature that they wouldn't have come in contact with otherwise.
While he had been known by the Irish form of his name, Seamus, at home, his workmates on the building sites of London found it easier to use the more familiar name Jim, which he then adopted. Through aligning himself with the international socialist movement, Jim found a way of expressing himself, working out his confused emotions in a useful way, and adapting his own experience in his fight against injustice. 30 years after his return from London, he expressed his life in terms of trauma, adaptation, and political engagement.
People die of TB unnecessarily. People having to emigrate to England at a young age without higher education, and denied the right to read books, and those things. That moulded me, that period, I suppose, the 40s and 50s. I'm proud of that. I hope I'm not a kind of a crank at all, or I have a chip on my shoulder, or that I'm in a groove, or that I can't learn from the past, or that I can adapt myself from those handicaps or those kind of influences. All those things that I encountered when I was young are still out there. They may have changed the character, changed the shape, or changed their appearance, but all those issues of injustice and inequality are there. And you must always be angry in struggling and standing against injustice in society.
One of the reasons for his return from London in 1960 was to help his brother Joe into the stonemason's trade. A building boom was underway in the country, and the construction of Shannon provided work for tradesmen from Limerick. When he returned from London, Jim brought with him a suitcase full of books unavailable in Ireland, and a new understanding of the inequality existing in his native city.
He discovered it for himself, that this poverty that he grew up with, saw all around him, wasn't really necessary. There was another way to do things, you know. And on the one hand, you contrasted with the wealth around Limerick at the time. At that point, where we lived in Garryowen, there wouldn't have been one single resident who would have had a car, for example. And you walk then sort of a relatively short distance from there to the places like Balnacolla and so on, and everybody had a car and a different way of life. People played tennis, played golf, you know. And Jim saw this because when he came back from England, he could talk about it readily, you know. So something occurred while he was over there that made him see that working people were given a raw deal.
Shortly after his return, he became involved in the Brick and Stone Layers Trade Union, and within 3 months was branch secretary. His experience of the wider world influenced his management of what at the time was a local craft workers' union.
As a socialist then, when he came back from Britain and got involved in union activity, he saw that the old craft unions were very conservative and overprotective and so on. And he helped, I suppose, to open the thing up. Because you couldn't become a bricklayer in those days, or a mason, unless your father was a mason. Occasionally, a nephew of a mason was allowed into the trade, but they were very, it was a closed shop.
Mr. John Flynn, who succeeded Jim as branch secretary, remembers the early years of the union and some of the challenges Jim faced.
35 years up to his death, he was secretary of this union. And he kept the thing going day in and day out. We often sat here, but there'd be nobody come up to pay their contributions. The work used to be slack at that time. You get nobody up here. But he's every Friday night, that was his life. Never missed this place. We done more behind the scenes than he done in front of the scenes. If you take all the apprentices that's actually gone through this mechanics, all those people, they're married now with families. They can thank Jim, because only for Jim and the way he worked the system up here in the mechanics, a lot of these people wouldn't be bricklayers, because we, including myself, we weren't very fond of this anchor trying to open up the books. But as I said, Jim had the foresight to see that the world was changing and we were moving on and we couldn't stay back and be passed out. And as I said, that's what he was like. He saw everything way ahead of ourselves.
In his article, Some Influential Books, Jim states that he became conscious of his limitations as a letter and report writer for the Union and set about educating himself. He says, "I developed a thirst for knowledge and read during most of my spare time." One of the books he sought out eagerly was The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists, which he ordered from its publishers in London through O'Mahony's bookshop. This political novel, set in the south of England, in the town of Hastings, was written by an Irish emigrant worker named Robert Noonan, who used the pseudonym Robert Purcell. The book describes the poverty and degradation of the town's workers and the cynicism and greed of their employers. The work made a profound and indelible impact on me, Jim wrote. For 3 weeks I laughed and grieved in turn as I read through its 54 chapters. When the book was later published in a Panther paperback edition in 1965, I bought a dozen copies and distributed them among my friends. So great was my desire to spread the book's socialist message. The following extract from the novel features its central character, the socialist Frank Owen, attempting to convince his hard-pressed workmates that they were more impoverished than they understood.
What I call poverty is when people are not able to secure for themselves all the benefits of civilization, the necessaries, the comforts, pleasures and refinements of life, leisures, books, theatres, pictures, music, holidays, travel, good and beautiful homes, good clothes, good and pleasant food. Everybody laughed. It was so ridiculous. The idea of the likes of them wanting or having such things. Any doubts that any of them had entertained as to Owen's sanity disappeared. The man was as mad as a March hare. If a man is only able to provide himself and his family with the bare necessaries of existence, that man's family is living in poverty. Since he cannot enjoy the advantages of civilization, he might as well be a savage. Better, in fact, for a savage knows nothing of what he is deprived. What we call civilization, the accumulation of knowledge which has come down to us from our forefathers, is the fruit of thousands of years of human thought and toil. It's not the result of the labour of the ancestors of any separate class of people who exist today, and therefore it is by right the common heritage of all. Every little child that is born into the world, no matter whether he is clever or dull, whether he is physically perfect or lame or blind, no matter how much he may excel or fall short of his fellows in other respects, in one thing at least he is their equal. He is one of the heirs of all the ages that have gone before.
The social circumstances of the 1960s allowed Jim enjoy some of that common heritage, which his upbringing helped him to appreciate. With the introduction of British and American popular culture into Ireland in the early 60s, and the burden of having to provide for his family greatly reduced, another side of Jim began to emerge.
The rock and roll era was just beginning, and my sister and I taught him how to jive. And he was very interested in music, and I think by then we had a record player, and I have vivid recollections of, him taking turns with us jiving, and he was a very good dancer and very light on his feet, and he later went to ballroom dance classes, and then he began to go to the dances, and he then began to be more of a natty dresser. He took an interest then in his 20s in I suppose everyone was we were working and there was a bit more money around, and he dressed very smartly, and he was very popular with the girls too in his 20s, and my sister was a hairdresser, you know, and people would be inquiring, you know, customers about him, you know, obviously interested.
There was always, however, more to Jim than met the eye. However much he enjoyed reading, music, dancing, and perhaps even fashion, socialism, or rather people, were his main interest. Rather than settling down and establishing a family of his own, he put his heart into the work at the Union. Margaret O'Donoghue, his secretary at his Limerick clinic, remembers an anecdote he told of his life at that time.
He said he was on a bus one time, and two women were sitting in front of him, and they didn't know he was behind, and they were discussing his broken romance at the time. He was only a young man. And one said to the other, "Sure, no wonder it broke up, he was always going to meetings."
Compassion for his fellow workers and pride in his work would have motivated this commitment of his to the Union.
The public persona of Jim was sometimes a bantering, almost aggressive person, but in private his persona was a profoundly gentle, almost old-fashioned gentleman, and he was only ever angry with those in power who abused their power. Our hypocrisy was something that galled him also.
That anger and indignation, and his concern for his co-workers, came together and found expression when he was called upon to make representations for union members.
He went once to represent a stonemason who was severely asthmatic and had missed a lot of time. And I don't know what the situation was about payment when a person was sick or whatever at the time, but this man asked, he was a young man, asked Jim to go to the city dispensary to plead for him for whatever monetary entitlement he had to get or something at the time. And when Jim came home, he was very indignant because of the way the doctor, who was a young man I gather too, had treated them, the way he had dealt with them. And Jim had pointed out to him it was the ordinary workers who were keeping him in his position, that everybody wasn't as fortunate as he, and being able to have that kind of an education, and that, you know, he had told him a few home truths, but he was very indignant at the treatment of the ordinary worker who had to go to these people who considered themselves in exalted positions and didn't treat, you know, the people who less fortunate, we'll say, very well in his opinion. And that really, I think, was the beginning of his interest in politics.
Continuing with his readings of socialist literature, he read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, whose narrative, in Jim's words, is set in the stockyards and beef factories of Chicago, and which tells of the gross exploitation and ill treatment of the workers, especially immigrants, by their bosses. Jim Kemmy notes that the publication of The Jungle led to a public outcry in America and brought about improvements in the working conditions in beef factories and stockyards. Then, he says, I next sought out socialist writers nearer home, and inevitably I turned to the works of James Connolly. Reading Labour in Irish History gave me new insights and a broader perspective on Irish history. Studying Connolly gave me my first political motivation. As there were no socialist parties or socialists in Limerick in 1963, I decided to join the Labour Party and do what I could to turn it into a socialist party, he stated in his article, Some Influential Books.
There was a new element, I think, arose at that time, a new thinking came into the movement in Limerick. And I suppose I was just a mental fog that because I was young at the time, and I had some ideas myself about the Labour Party. I felt time had come to change things and revitalise things and jazz things up a bit in Limerick, in the Labour Party. We should attract young people, be more vigorous, more vibrant party. And Connolly had something to say about these things.
Jim harboured no electoral ambitions during his early years in the Labour Party, but instead became involved in local party organisation, where he became Director of Elections in the constituency. This led, later, to his membership of the party's National Administrative Council. In 1965 he entered the employment of Limerick Corporation, where he continued to work as a stonemason until 1981. The nature of his work there allowed him to leave the job when occasion demanded, to attend to the domestic and personal difficulties brought to his attention by inhabitants of the city's wards, augmenting both his knowledge of party organisation and experience in making representations for others. In 1965, Jim Kemmy also enrolled in the School of Commerce on Mulgrave Street for a 2-year extramural diploma in social science run by the University College Cork. With a focus on community development, the diploma offered Jim the opportunity to study the subjects of sociology, economics, procedure at meetings, and public administration. Historians were among those who taught on the course, and Jim debated with lecturers and students on aspects of Irish labour history. He was conferred in September 1967, and in the same year visited the USSR as part of a trade union delegation attending the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. The role that the culture of the people played in Soviet life was what impressed him most.
He was hugely impressed by the fact that it seemed like an enormously egalitarian society. He loved the fact that ordinary workers could get a seat at the Kirov and that could live in decently heated homes, modest but nevertheless heated, and had a better quality of life.
Here he experienced in reality what could only be expressed as an ideal by the character Frank Owen in The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists.
But don't you think it's worthwhile trying to find out whether it's possible to so arrange things that we may be able to live like civilized human beings without being alternatively worked to death or starved?
Political differences between Jim Kemmy and other members of the Labour Party began to emerge in the course of the following few years. One instance which caused a clear division involved a communist organisation which had established itself in Limerick to propagate the political ideas of Chairman Mao.
In the late 60s, the Maoist bookshop opened opposite King John's Castle. Two ex-university students, I think they dropped out of university. One guy was called Arthur Allen, and the other fellow was Ronan O'Brien. They came to Limerick and set up the shop and filled it with Mao's Little Red Book and other stuff like that. Nobody paid any particular attention to it for a while, but then there was an incident one night when somebody fired a shotgun through the window, and Steve Coughlin, who was the Labour TD in Limerick at the time, issued some sort of inflammatory statements about the shop, suggesting it should be closed down and it shouldn't be allowed to operate in a city like Limerick or a country like Ireland.
The Maoists' activities included the production of a number of local publications, such as the Anti-Cheap Labour League and the Red Star broadsheet. Though Jim was not affiliated with them, he upheld the right of the Maoists to express their views.
Jim defended their right against sort of the opposition that was coming forward. He defended their right to disseminate their own literature in the city. As a Democrat, he felt that we shouldn't take any action against them, let them operate like anybody else in a free society, you know.
As Mayor of Limerick in 1969-70, Labour TD Stephen Coughlin drew further fire from Jim on other controversial issues. On one occasion, Jim led a demonstration to protest against the Mayor's official reception for the South African Springboks rugby tour. He also publicly challenged Mr. Coughlin on the latter's alleged anti-Semitic remarks at a credit union conference in 1970. With the rift widening between Jim's socialist ideals and the policy of the Labour Party, he formed a study group whose goal was to generate awareness and discussion on current issues through organising debates between well-known public figures.
He set up a group called the Limerick Socialist Study Group, and that had debates on a monthly basis. And people like Conor Cruz O'Brien were invited to Limerick to speak. And there were always two sides to it, because he liked a healthy debate and let the punters make their minds up then on listening to it, you know.
Dr. Cruz O'Brien and Dr. Noel Brown were just two of a number of speakers who drew the crowds in Limerick.
I remember one we were at the Savoy. When the Savoy was filled to capacity, Bernadette Devlin spoke on it. I remember another occasion, Owen Harris, who was in the official Sinn Féin at the time, spoke, debated the national question with a man called Brendan Clifford. And, you know, he organised many such public debates, advertised in the local press. and you go and piece the issues out.
While remaining within the Labour Party for the time being, Jim continued to think and to act independently of it. One of the points on which he adopted a radical and independent stance, and which remained a contentious issue during much of his political career, was the question of the status of Northern Ireland. Having studied the political arguments involved, Jim took up an anti-nationalist position and aligned himself with the policy produced by the British and Irish Communist Organisation. Manus O'Riordan, chairman of the Dublin branch of the B&ICO from 1971 to 82, explains the organisation's formation and goals.
It came together in the mid-1960s as the Irish Communist Organisation amongst a group of Irish emigrants in London. It was in fact initially established in London, and these returned emigrants subsequently settled in Dublin and Belfast, and the Irish Communist Organisation was operational in both North and South from the late 1960s, publishing a magazine called the Irish Communist, which ran from the mid-60s up till I think 1986, and I myself became a member of that organisation in 1971.
Jim's association with the B&ICO did not, however, involve membership.
Well, Jim Kemmy was never a communist, and therefore the point of contact with the British and Irish Communist Organisation was through a shared viewpoint on the national question, and therefore a willingness to participate in broad fronts. So in terms of the other issues that divided communists and social democrats at the time, Jim would have sometimes been in agreement with the B&ICO and sometimes in conflict with them. It was the view of the national question that and also a view on the need to separate church and state, which led to, if you like, a common front on those type of issues throughout the course of the 1970s.
The policy on the Northern question generated by Brendan Clifford and Pat Murphy of that organisation was the one Jim adopted, despite the groundswell of nationalist opinion current among leftist parties at the time.
The problem with left-wing politics at the time was that left-wing politics went along with the common viewpoint that simplistically the national question in Northern Ireland was a question solely of British occupation of the North, and the objective was to secure British withdrawal. Left-wing politics did not seriously assess the nature of Northern Irish society itself, and it was through setting out to make sense of the particular history of Northern Ireland that the writers in the British and Irish Communist Organisation came to the conclusion that you had to recognise that what had occurred in Ireland was the development of two distinct national communities. And if there was to be a united Ireland in the future, it wasn't going to be on the basis of demanding British withdrawal. It was on the basis of the two communities coming to terms with each other and perhaps voluntarily agreeing to united Ireland. But a precondition for voluntary unity was acceptance of the principle of consent. And for that reason, the British and Irish Communist Organisation was the first political organisation in the Republic of Ireland to demand the repeal of Articles 2 and 3. And Jim accepted that analysis and flung himself into the campaign for that particular struggle.
Kemmy's dissatisfaction with the Labour Party led to his resignation in 1972. Conor Cruise O'Brien, writing in the Sunday Independent, recalled the circumstances of Jim's departure. We first got to know one another in the early 1970s when we were both in the Labour Party. When Stevie Coughlin made a statement apparently justifying the persecution of the Jews of Limerick in 1904, both Jim and I moved against him. At the annual conference of the Irish Labour Party in 1972, I proposed the expulsion of Coughlin from the party because of those remarks, which Coughlin refused to withdraw. My motion was defeated. Jim Kemmy resigned from the Labour Party that year over the issue. Mark Brennock, writing in the Irish Times, notes, Mr. Kemmy resigned with 38 other officials and members of the party, declaring that the party is not a socialist party and that it will not lead the Irish working class to state power. A statement from the 39 reserved particular vitriol for Mr. Coughlin, saying that he faithfully and consistently served the interests of the enemies of the workers. The anti-democratic and anti-socialist campaigns, actions and speeches of the party deputy from East Limerick has made Limerick and the Labour Party a byword for bigotry and witch hunting. In the Limerick Leader, Ted Gale wrote in 1972, Mr. Kemmy said that they had given over 12 months in preparing an alternative structure to the Labour Party. They had now set up the new working class movement, the Limerick Socialist Organisation, having laid the foundations for it by careful planning and preparation. It will be a completely independent, autonomous movement, but will cooperate on specific issues with other working class and left-wing groups in Ireland. Mr. Kemmy also announced the launching of a new monthly newspaper, the Limerick Socialist, this Friday. It will, he said, take up an uncompromising working class position. It will give commentary and analysis of politics, trade unions and workers' affairs generally, and is being written, produced and sold almost entirely by workers in the Limerick Socialist Organisation. It is the first working class newspaper of its kind in Limerick for over 50 years. The first issue, selling at 6p, had a masthead reading, Limerick Socialist, Voice of the Worker, and a quotation from James Connolly, That which is good for the working class I esteem patriotic. Despite the political content of the newspaper, the articles avoided the use of jargon.
I think a point that might be made about Jim Kemmy in relation to the left. People in the left, especially people in what you could describe as the sectarian left, the politically sectarian left, smaller groups of people who adopt a Marxist approach to life, sometimes adopt what they consider to be Marxist language. And very often it isn't, and very often it's entirely inappropriate. But most of all, it's mystifying to ordinary people. And one of the very important things about Jim Kemmy, and it arises from his view of culture and his view of the way things are and the different influences on life, was that he spoke about his political ideas in a very ordinary way, in a way that nobody could misunderstand, nobody could mistake.
The tone of the Limerick Socialist was set by the leading article of the first issue, under the heading, The Great Danish Doughboy. The article begins, Cranks, head cases and oddballs of all sorts turn up weekly on the RTE programme Hall's Pictorial Weekly, and continues by stating that it was therefore completely in context that the programme featured a certain confectioner based in Limerick, whose complaints against Limerick workers the article challenges. Poking fun at the baker's industrial relations record, it called for, among other things, the unionisation of his staff and, if necessary, a boycott of his shop. The Limerick Socialist also carried polemical analysis of local politics and political organisations and heroes.
I remember the first time he wrote an article about Sean South, for example, and it was tantamount to heresy, the article he'd written about South, because he reassessed South's life and he found that there were things in his life that suggested he was almost a right-wing fascist, strongly under the influence of Maria Duce, or one of those Catholic lay organisations. And he put this into print, which was the first time in Ireland it had been written. And nobody could deny it because it was all well documented. Also, he researched the files of the Limerick Leader, and he came across all these letters Sean South had written attacking the Hollywood actors along McCarthy lines, suggesting that they were a dangerous communist element, coming into our cinemas, and we had to be on our guard against it, and calling for a boycott of these films with these actors that McCarthy had named as communists.
Pulling no punches and commenting on local events with a mixture of analysis, plain speaking and satire, it wasn't warmly received by all. It included articles on and excerpts from the works of Limerick writers. Michael Hogan, the Bard of Thomond, Brian Merriman, Sean Burke and John Liddy were among those given space, as was an article on Kate O'Brien by David Hanley.
I got a letter from him, I think, when I was a young reporter and features writer in the RTE Guide back in the 60s. This letter was about an article I had written about Kate O'Brien, who was also a neighbour's child down there on Mulgrave Street. And he wanted permission to reproduce it in, I think it was the Limerick Socialist. I'm not quite sure now. It may have been in a different magazine, the old Limerick Journal. But I think that came later. And anyway, not only was he aware of the fact that I had written it, but he had followed my career and was very congratulatory about it. And this really took my breath away, because my experience of Limerick reaction to any kind of success at all was negative in the extreme. Begrudgery was rampant, and it's still there in pockets. But he was not only totally free of it, he was quite unreasonably proud of the success of anybody from Limerick.
Having created a platform for his political ideals through the pages of the Limerick Socialist, Jim Kemmy then registered as a non-party candidate in the local elections of 1974. His love of music and his pride in Limerick's musical traditions found expression in his association with the Boher Boy Band during the electoral campaign.
He was going around canvassing there, and he saw the band again. He says, I'm going to bring the band.
Pat Phelan, a senior member of the band.
He took us around Moyross, Ballinanty, Prospect. I had us up in an old cart and we played, and he, you know, it brought the crowds out, you know. And then he'd give his old bit of an old speech, you know, and he'd take us back again, and he's, next week now lads, we'll do the same thing in a different place, you know. So the lads enjoyed it, you know, we all enjoyed going around there, and he was a great old character, you know.
Many of the political and cultural causes that Jim Kemmy had advocated during the previous decade were the issues on which he stood for election. Mark Brennock records.
Mr. Kemmy's advocacy of socialism was combined with anti-nationalism and support for the separation of church and state. He was elected to Limerick City Council in 1974, advocating a social and cultural revolution, the availability of contraceptive devices, and the deletion of Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution. At the council's first sitting, he refused to wear the ceremonial crimson robes.
Later that same year, he took his stand as a public representative on the issue of the relations between church and state, again in the words of Mark Brennock.
His hostility to the Catholic Church was expressed on many occasions. In 1974, he turned down an invitation to attend the consecration of Dr. Jeremiah Noonan as Bishop of Limerick. He maintained that it was not the business of state or local authority representatives to get involved in such ceremonies. He said at the time, "The event, with its ostentatious pomp, elaborate rituals, ornate vestments, extravagant reception, and wealthy influential guests, clearly shows how far the Catholic Church in Ireland has departed from the original simple Christian message, and how it has shackled itself to the economic and political ruling class."
Jim Kemmy's attitudes to the church hadn't greatly changed by 1990, when he raised the question of the church's commitment to the second commandment quoted by Christ.
The aspect of the church stands for love thy neighbour as thyself. That's a very Christian principle, a basic Christian principle. It's often not honoured in its observance, and it should be, that aspect of Christianity. And it's a good one, I think, to think about, because we are living in a world where we have great poverty, great suffering, great inequality, and the church does profess to be concerned with love thy neighbour.
Another of the causes central to his election campaign, the call for the availability of contraceptive devices, remained as one of his political concerns after election. It was a national issue, the Dáil having voted on the government's contraceptives bill in July of 1974. Jim brought the debate to Limerick. As Jean Kerrigan writes, in what to outsiders seemed the heartland of reaction, Confraternity City, Jim Kemmy was finding ordinary people responding to practical solutions to deep-felt needs. By 1975, he had successfully campaigned to set up a family planning clinic. The clinic was strongly opposed, to the extent that no members of the medical profession in Limerick would work there in its early years, and for the first 2 years it was visited each week only by a Dublin physician. Martin Byrne, writing in the Limerick Leader, comments on the reaction to the clinic. Kemmy was fiercely condemned in Sunday sermons, and one parish priest labelled women who attended the clinic as Kemmy's femmies. But criticism never bothered him, and it was reported that he called it one of his proudest memories. Jim Kemmy was also proud of his relationship with the Boher Boy Band, which was further developed during the mid-1970s. At that time their practicing hall was collapsing and there was need for a new building. Jim, who wanted to show his appreciation to the band for their part in his election success, undertook the construction.
He was very grateful for what they did, and he never forgot it. You know. So when the band room then finally had to be knocked before it was falling down, we'd be cut for insurance if it fell on top of anyone. You know. So Jim came in again and to give us a hand. And by God, he came in with 100%, you know. We'll build it, lads, we'll build it, you know. By God, he did, you know.
The band, in return, recognised his work on their behalf.
Jim was an honorary vice chairman of the band from that time, from 1976, you know, when he did so much good for the band. He loved the band. Of course, he loved everything about Limerick.
His love for the city was bound up with a strong attachment to its history and traditions, which had coloured much of his own character.
Nobody in Limerick can miss singing and music. I mean, I don't know how you could grow up in or near Limerick and not be aware of four-part harmony and all that, and the Sicilians and the musical tradition which went way back to O'Mara, the tenor of the late 18th century, early 19th century. So, I mean, Jim had all of that within him.
Jim's links with the Boher Boy Band would have been all the more satisfying for him, since the band, many of whom were workers, had taken the fruits of civilization and made of them their own.
There'd be fellas over in the People's Park, and the band would play 2 hours, and before each little piece they'd have a little stand with the name of the piece that they were playing, like La Bohème or Rigoletto or the overture to Marcianello or the overture to Orpheus in the Underworld. And then the famous operas from La Traviata, you know, you'd have people, work fellas down in labourers working all over, and they'd be all whistling those airs, you know. And they had no television, no radios, they had no radiograms, but everyone, when the band would go over to the park, they'd all come away whistling all these famous arias because the band would be playing them.